Hi there. So I got this recently, Selling the War, Art and Propaganda in World War II. It is an abiding subject for myself. I just love military history, obviously because I served in the Royal Navy. Look at that. And this kind of thing, it just appeals to myself. It mixes all the things I love, art, bit of philosophy and ethics, or not, and war. So, I know it's not for everyone, but I love it. And I thought I'd just talk about this wonderful find. But I'm going to read the dust jacket first, because it's actually quite interesting. During the Second World War, posters were one of the most widely used instruments of persuasion. Their impact was immediate and forceful, and they expressed in the clearest possible terms the preoccupations of a nation's political leaders and propagandists. Posters found a wide variety of uses on both sides, and that's something we need to remember. It wasn't just propaganda on the Axis or the German, Italian, fascist Italian side and their allies. It was also on the Allied side. And although it's set in World War II, there's quite a few pages devoted to the lead up to that, and specifically propaganda in World War I. The posters, and that's mainly what they are, were appeals to patriotism in aid of recruitment, warnings to preserve national security against spies and saboteurs, pleas to aid the war effort by stepping up production at home, morale-boosting posters portraying the nation's allies and emphasising the international character of the crusade, and warnings of the atrocities committed by the enemy or the consequences of defeat and occupation. I'm going to take the dust jacket off. I'm going to show this great picture on the inside front cover. You can see how important posters were during the war. Nearly all of them, like save coal, every woman not doing vital work is needed now, lend a hand, war savings, and so on. This is an American one. So prior to the war, it was the Army Air Force. There wasn't the US Air Force that came. And look at the words at the top. "O'er the ramparts we watch." That's from the national anthem of the United States. And yet he's cradling a bomb. Wow. The person who put this together, I'm assuming is Polish, Zbynek, Zeman, could be Czech. But there are images of Poland, so I'm assuming it's Poland. Beautifully done, and it doesn't shy away from the dark side, the very dark side of propaganda that was used in Germany to pollute the minds of Germans against Jews. I don't think there's a need to show that. We know how bad that got. There's quite some interesting points in the introduction. I'm just going to read out a couple. So posters reflect the mood of the time. In particular, the prevalent styles of painting and draftsmanship. And I know that leading up to the war, the futurist movement, which was very popular in Italy, was a form of propaganda to show the endeavours of speed, so planes and fast cars, that fascinated the psyche of the fascisti in the lead up to Second World War. And yet some of the artwork is stunning. There's a close link between the technical level of commercial advertising as well and propaganda. So the propaganda way of putting posters really came from advertisements, which go back quite a few decades before the First World War even. So you see these wonderful pictures of, say, omnibuses in London or on the metro leading up out of Paris stations, that they'd have these wraparound posters or posters. They were ephemeral and disposable, and that was, I think, very important, because if anyone ever ripped them down or weather got to them, they could just be replaced easily. It wasn't like you are building a massive church for propaganda reasons, which did happen, or doing a painting, although they became popular as well, especially for Hitler, who wanted to be seen in certain poses. Mainly photography, but he also did it as paintings. It is no accident that the fascist one-party states of the 20th century and their leaders gave so much thought to propaganda in all its forms. So much so that Goebbels, and he is shown in here, I'll come to that momentarily, who really helped form in the German people's minds what Hitler was. He became the minister of the Ministry of Propaganda. That's what it was called. There was no trying to hide the fact. Mussolini and the fascists, Hitler and the Nazis, Franco and his phalangists, they all operated in at least partly industrialized states. They all believed that the individual should be subordinated to the state, and propaganda could alter the minds of millions. But don't just think it was those on the right. On the left, it was just equally as bad, because Lenin and the Bolsheviks did exactly the same. Lenin, for instance, he wanted to shock, and I'm reading here from the book, the Russian state out of its backwardness, and propaganda was one way to do that. Hitler and Mussolini wanted to make their states bigger rather than better, or they confused those two goals. Western liberal democracies, on the other hand, employed propaganda in wartime only. And there's a whole paragraph here that I think I'd like to read out, so I apologise I'm reading a lot from the book. There are, of course, election campaigns in liberal countries. When propaganda temporarily raised its head, still does. There are, for instance, road safety campaigns or metrication campaigns. Many of the liberal democracies carried out their Second World War systems of external broadcasts, but this is the only form of propaganda in American Britain and other West European countries which is carried on a permanent basis and which is sponsored by the state. Interesting. We start in the book looking at German words and German deeds, but this is from World War I. And what it's trying to show or educate the general populace, that when things were written in German or German newspapers, or it was tried to be broadcast abroad, some of the words had to be decoded. But again, this itself could be propaganda, it could be trying to slur the Germans. So, for instance, if the German, and it's actually credited to a Professor Rothe, we see everywhere how our soldiers respect the sacred defenselessness of woman and child. And next to it, this is the propaganda element, appendix to the report of the Bryce Committee, it says, as they continued their advance, the Germans collected about 400 men, women and children, some of the women with babies in their arms, from Campano, Elui and Malines, and drove them forward as a screen against the Belgian forces, holding out the outer ring of the Antwerp lines. So it could be quite powerful, possibly insidious. I'm going to show you this picture here. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. Now that's a very famous portrait that was made about that buffoon Hitler. And the actual book states here, at first, Hitler was presented to the Germans as a spokesman of a hard-pressed generation which had fought and lost a just war. And when you see the pictures of him in the 1920s, when he's leading at the front and the attempted putsch walking through the streets of Munich, he is in that trench coat. Because for the general populace, that's what they wanted to put across. He's a hard-working man. And it says here, the belted Macintosh, the hat with its brim turned down, the beer cellar fights and the street fights, added up to the image of an ex-serviceman in a civilian uniform who carried on the fight. But then Goebbels brought out Hitler's qualities, willpower and ability, with luck thrown in. Suddenly we see images that try to show Hitler as the prophet, Hitler the fighter, Hitler the understanding human being. It's all make-believe. And there's a set of portraits in which photographs were taken of Hitler, quite dramatically shadowed, and which is doing this and trying different poses to see which is the most effective. It's an act. After 1933, Goebbels released the full charisma of the leader. Yeah, right. He had taken up the work of Bismarck to the German people. He was revered by the overwhelming majority of the people, according to Goebbels. And that hard-hitting caption which I showed you, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one nation, one empire, one leader. And a lot of it is down to the club-footed one, Goebbels. In return, this is what the Soviets showed. Hitler as a hatchet. You can almost date that. If you know history, you know it certainly wasn't before 1941 that happened. This would have been after Operation Barbarossa. Now, again, if you know history, when the Nazis dominated Europe, Churchill had the prescience of mind to understand that he called it the soft underbelly, which was Italy. Now, Italy is a long nation, very mountainous. And it was known that if you're going to go via Italy, one, you need to soften up the people. So there would have been a lot of propaganda aimed at the Italian people. But where do you land? And of course, Operation Husky was to land predominantly American and British forces in Sicily. Then, once that was secured, get beachheads into southern Italy, Anzio, and then start going up the spine. But it took a long time. The weather, the mountains. And the Nazis did their own form, because if you just see this, it's in English, it's a long way to Rome, and it's like a snail with the flags of the United Kingdom, Commonwealth and Empire, and the United States of America. They would literally do everything to needle the enemy. The choice of words in a book, in a song, in a play, in the comics, it's like an art. Well, it is an art. Same with the posters. So when you see something like this, you know it's British. Arthur Moe, National Service needs you, learn now, be ready. Arthur Moe. That's appealing to the then working man, possibly in southern Britain. Now, if you think that Goebbels was insidious by the way in which he tried to depict Hitler, again, this is on two sides. Look at Churchill. The British Bulldog. Some of the most effective for myself of any propaganda posters are the ones in which the pictures speak for themselves. Again, you're going to see the swastika, which I don't like showing, but if you see this, you can see that 1939, the British Lion and the Navy are almost prone. 1940, it's almost as though the Lion is taking notice. But look at the difference by 1942 and the strength of the planes and the Navy, which is now joined by the Americans. And that Lion is roaring. But also note how the enemy's size is diminishing. Very powerfully done. Very memorable. It's the choice of subject matter and who, again, they're appealing to. Now, I'm going to mispronounce it, but a mate of mine knows Russian, and I do know that the Russian word for motherland is Rodina. I think it's Rodina or Rodina. I can never pronounce it. Sorry, Steve. I know you'd know. That picture here of the Russian woman, the mother for the motherland. And it says here, it's by Irakli Toyja. It's a poster. It says, "Your mother country appeals to you." It appeared after the German invasion of Russia in 1941, and it was hard, dark times then in Russia. They lost millions. The female figure represents the mother country holding the text of the Russian military oath in her hand, and the background of bayonets is simple and effective. Show it again. Often, certainly with war posters, this American one, it's appealing to then the sensibilities that the soldiers were doing the same that had to be done in 1778 for the Revolution, the War of Independence. There is often an appeal to the past and great glories and defending the rights of history of a nation, especially when they're attacked. This one I'm about to show you would have been produced sometime probably late 44-45 as the war is ending. So there was a race for Berlin, and the Russians, the Soviets, were the first to get there. There was the Cold War, and the Brandenburg Gate eventually ended up in the middle of no man's land in the Berlin Wall. But look, this is the Russians coming in, but they're showing the American and the British flags at the Brandenburg Gate. Amazing how quickly that would change. There's a lot in here of famous posters that are all to do with loose talk. Don't speak out in public because loose lips sink ships. Actually, I don't think that's in here. But there are excellent examples from other countries. This is probably something similar. Keep it dark, careless talk costs lives. And there's one here, it was a cartoon in an English paper, and it's two old dears on a bus, and look who's behind them. Goering and Hitler himself. Careless talks cost lives. Of course, it's amazing now when we look back, but there had to be continual propaganda to get people to go to work in the factories, and why they're doing such as they are. So America's answer to the war is to increase production, and it was because of the sheer might of American industry that really Britain could sustain the war effort because of Lend-Lease. I mean, it bankrupted Britain for decades afterwards, but at least it got them to survive. Overly dramatic artwork. If you substituted the soldier there for Marianne in France and changed the flag, you could almost assume it's the French Revolution. Obviously, pictures of the leader. That's FDR. They would be used. There was much towards certainly 43 onwards, when it was decided that finally they were going to make plans to, the Allies this is, to get into Europe, that much must be done to persuade people back in the home countries that who were considered to have been old enemies were now friends. And much was done to show a united front. So this is America, the Soviet Union and Britain. Not just for that, it's also the fact that the British Commonwealth had to be shown walking together. And if I remember, having read the war diaries or the books that Churchill wrote, excellent set of books about the war, he got quite upset with Australia and the way that, certainly after Tobruk, things seemed to sour. Much is talked about how much did the Allies know about Shoah, the Holocaust, and the fact that the Germans were going against the Geneva Conventions in the treatment of prisoners of war, especially Russian Soviet soldiers. It's estimated anything up to 1.5 million, probably more, of Russian soldiers have been captured and were put into forced camps in which they were starved to death. But this one's interesting because this is an American poster trying to raise funds for Yugoslav prisoners of war. Amazing. It's also appealing to the general populace of certain countries that we have been blooded and harmed. What are you going to do about it? I don't think I need to say much about this one. This one happens to come from the side that lost the war, the Nazis. So it's par for the course, really, regarding some of the stuff that they was putting out before the war, during and after. But it tells you that there was, I think Christopher Hitchens talked a lot about this, about how there was a big racial element in the war. And this one is by the Nazis. And what it's trying to show is what's happening in Italy. Churches are being destroyed, but look at the soldier here. That's a black American soldier. But look at the way he is depicted. Not pleasant. The fact that they got to that length tells you a lot about how savage and appalling it was towards the end. So this is a difficult type of book to think about because of the sheer nature of the atrocities that were committed, the use of propaganda, which rightly has a bad name. I mean, someone said when I was in publishing that PR is only one step away from propaganda. You're trying to convince people of a narrative that you assume they're going to accept, because when it's put in front of them, the whole point of propaganda is to make them agree to what, well, the state, the organisation wants, whoever's doing it. So it's difficult. And some of the artwork, how it's depicted, triggers people. It's not pleasant. But that's the whole point. The whole point is to destabilize whole peoples, either domestically or internationally. And it hasn't stopped. It didn't stop throughout the Cold War. You can do a whole book, probably there will be many of them, of posters during the Cold War. I grew up hearing very much, specifically from across the pond, better dead than red. And there was this hatred of anything socialist or communist, because in the mindset of those who weren't that way, they were all clumped together. So, of course, when you got British socialist governments, often known as Labour, that didn't go down very well, and so on. So it can poison people's minds beyond the time limit it's meant to have an effect. So after the war, if I'm correct, and I'm prepared to be proven wrong here, if anyone knows, put it in the comments. But at the Nuremberg trials, a lot of mention was made about propaganda. I'm going to look that up. Yeah, I was correct. So in October 1945, the International Military Tribunal indicted 24 German officials as major Nazi war criminals. Of those, 21 men stood trial in Nuremberg. 2 defendants faced prosecution specifically for their propaganda activities. And part of the denazification process of Germany after the war was to get rid of all of that and to try and get out of people's minds what had been put in. And you only have to watch Inception, the movie, to know how difficult it is. Once things are rooted in here, difficult to get out. So a difficult but interesting and important subject. It won't appeal to a lot of people, I know. So propaganda. Ta-ta for now.